Good morning, welcome. Come and take a seat. We're going to make a start on the next part of our morning together. Big welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, it's great to have you. If you're joining us online, why don't you say hello in the chat. And if we haven't met before, my name's Sam, and I head up the tech team here. Just a big shout out to that team who make all of the sound most of the time work, and words, and our live stream on YouTube as well. So again, if you've missed some of our recent messages, you can catch up all of those on our YouTube channel in the week. Now, and just wanted to say that being part of that team takes a lot of dedication, hard work, and of course a very good sense of humour, especially having to put up with me. So big shout out to that team. It's great to serve together, and it's a real joy to be here this morning sharing with you. Now, maybe you missed it this week, and if you have, then I will just make it clear it is definitely too late. But on Wednesday, it was Valentine's Day, marked around the world, as most of us will know, on February the 14th, every February the 14th. And it's a day when we celebrate, or some of us anyway, celebrate romance and love. And statistics show from a bit of research I was doing that 2/3 of people in the UK do something to celebrate Valentine's Day. And if you're joining us online, maybe put in the chat something. If you did something to celebrate it this year, give us a little hint of maybe what you did. But there's a great deal of mystery, it seems, surrounds the origins of Valentine's Day. It's not clear kind of where it kind of originally came from in history, generally regarded as a Christian feast to celebrate a character called Saint Valentine, who was martyred in Roman times, supposedly for ministering to Christians who are under a great deal of persecution. But over time, different legends have been added to that story. Particularly, I think, when I was reading, some 500 years later, supposedly Saint Valentine, just before his execution, wrote a note to his jailer's daughter, which he signed, "From your Valentine." So perhaps that gives rise to the sort of popularity of Valentine's cards and those sorts of celebrations. Certainly, I guess some people not missing the commercial opportunity to exploit that somewhat. Now, I suppose we all know that we have been going through a cost of living crisis for a number of years now. But it seems, though, that this hasn't dampened our enthusiasm for Valentine's Day. I was doing a bit of research over the last few days, and I couldn't quite get my head around this, but apparently the expected expenditure for this year's Valentine's Day in the UK was in a whopping £1.5 billion. Now, I did try and check a few different places. It seems to have gone up considerably from a few years ago. In 2021, where it was an estimated just shy of 100 million was spent. So quite a staggering increase. But that's a lot of money on cards and flowers, fizzy drinks, perhaps of the alcoholic variety, chocolates, but maybe spa days, fancy frocks and snazzy shirts. Obviously, there's always room for other types of Valentine's gifts as well, depending on the recipient. But perhaps this is so important that we feel necessary as a nation that this is a huge priority for us. And they say that money can't buy love. Well, we'll see. Now, my mum and stepfather, from that generation who love to sort of live thrifty lives, and they've come up with this really, I think, I haven't come across it anywhere else before, approach to countercultural living in this sort of Valentine's Day-induced spending frenzy. So normally what they do on Valentine's Day or just before is they'll visit a card shop together. Well, it seems now there's even fewer card shops around, but they've obviously managed to find one, and they'll go their separate ways inside the card shop and select a really meaningful Valentine's Day card for each other. They'll then, obviously, after they've chosen that, bring their cards to one another and exchange the cards and have a nice romantic moment to see what card the other one has chosen for them. And then after this deeply moving moment, they'll put the cards back on the shelf and withdraw. And the money they saved on Valentine's Day, they'll go and enjoy a coffee together somewhere. So perhaps there's a tip for you for next year if you're finding Valentine's Day spending is getting a bit carried away. But that aside, over the past few weeks, we've been looking at this theme called "The Greatest is Love." And we've been looking at the commandments that Jesus gave us and his followers about how we love God and how we love one another. And I guess it's down to us to interpret that for what does that mean for us here and now in 2024 in the culture and the society that we live in. So I want to recap one of those encounters. It was recorded in the book of Matthew in chapter 22. And I'm going to read from the Message translation. Now, if you haven't come across this before, you've heard it, but you're not really sure what are all these different translations. Well, this particular translation is really designed to help us when we're reading the Bible, to help us really grasp the sort of main thrust of what's being said. And it was translated from the original Greek, which the New Testament generally was written in at the time. But I really encourage you, it's a great translation. There are, of course, many others. But sometimes it just helps us to how we can access the Bible, particularly if you're new to faith or you're just exploring. The Bible can seem quite difficult, confusing, awkward to get to grips with. I certainly remember opening my first youth Bible many years ago and just wondering, where do I start? The first sort of big chunk of it seemed full of sort of odd history with people with complicated names that no one seemed to be able to pronounce. And then as I came on to the kind of the New Testament, the first four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really looking at the life of Jesus, they were quite sort of easy to get into. But then as those books carried on, it got sort of more and more difficult for me to sort of figure out what on earth was going on. And so just really encourage, different translations are a great way just to try and make a start. And I'd really encourage one thing as well, which is the YouVersion Bible app for your smartphone. If you just search Bible on the App Store, you'll find it. It's a free app. I think it's got, over 3,000 different Bible versions, 2,000 different languages. I mean, it is brilliant. As reading plans, it's really accessible. So if you're just wrestling a bit with getting into reading the Bible, I really encourage that as a good way to make a start. And maybe if you found that actually you've just got sort of tired and bored of looking at it, then maybe that can help kind of rekindle and reawaken how you access that. So anyway, let's get into this passage from Matthew chapter 22. It's from verse 34, and it records this encounter like this. When the Pharisees heard how he had bested the Sadducees, they gathered their forces for an assault. One of the religious scholars spoke for them, posing a question they hoped would show him up. "Teacher, which command in God's law is the most important?" Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence. This is the most important, the first on any list. But there is a second to set alongside it. Love others as well as you love yourself. These two commands are pegs. Everything in God's law and the prophets hangs from them." So Jesus wasn't making himself particularly popular. I mean, he certainly wasn't a people pleaser. He didn't go out of his way just to say things that people wanted to hear, to get them on his side. In fact, a lot of the time when we read these stories, we see people come to Jesus and often they walk away feeling somewhat uncomfortable and unsettled. Maybe not from the statements he's made, although sometimes, but often from the questions that he would ask and pose back to those inquiring. And it usually left something hanging, because often the question that the person came with really betrayed or was trying to hide their real motivations. And Jesus in these encounters doesn't always directly answer that question, but provokes something in them to challenge where they're at in their life and their approach and their attitude to God and to others. Now we know that when we choose to follow Jesus, that his Spirit comes to live in us. And that can bring both comfort and oftentimes a stirring and a challenge when something isn't right. Now what we can see in this little encounter just prior to this, if we read back, you can read back a little bit the previous verses, that the Sadducees, and these were, again, another slightly complicated name from the time, but these were the wealthy ruling class. They had political and religious influence at the time, and they had tried to entrap Jesus with what they thought were some clever questions, some tricky things to pose at him, and he'd quickly shown them up, and the crowd had realized that actually they were just trying to trip him up, and he'd shown them up for what they really were. Now, one key difference between this group, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, was that the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection from the dead. They didn't believe in the afterlife or spirit realm. But they were trying to trick Jesus. Now, the other group that we read about here, the Pharisees, I'm sure they're aware of what just happened. We don't know this, but perhaps they're thinking now's our chance to get one up on this group by we're able to pose a difficult question and catch Jesus out. But they may certainly have been troubled by this teacher who's kind of come from this backward nowhere town and is now able to demonstrate such wisdom and command of the law that even those who are learned scholars are being caught out with. So they decided to come up with their own tricky conundrum. Now we don't, again, the man who steps forward to pose the question, we don't know much about him, but he is noted as being an expert in the law. Now this wasn't just the law of the land. We have to remember at the time that Israel was occupied and under Roman rule, but this would have been the religious laws. And there would have been many of those that this man would have been an expert in. And you may have heard of the 10 Commandments. These were 10 instructions that God gave to Moses a long time back in history, recorded in the early books of the Bible. But this sort of list of laws only kind of expanded over time. And the Jewish religious leaders just seemed to keep on adding more and more rules and laws to try and help themselves to make themselves right with God. Whenever they found a scenario, whether it was how to deal with money or with things that were unclean, they would have to create either some new ways of how you approach that and new rules. And they tried their very hardest, particularly those in the elite, the Pharisees and those Sadducees. They would be trying very hard to make sure that they kept and lived in obedience to all of those rules. And their thinking was, if we can do this, then we will be not only better than everyone else and distinguish ourselves in that way, but this is the way to having a right relationship with God. Now, I think we can all probably attest to the fact that if we tried to live up to even any basic rules 100% of the time, that we would struggle. And so, well, what then evolved was this huge swathe of rules and regulations and laws that would have to be applied at different times, in different contexts, in different ways for different people. And so to be an expert in the law would have meant that this person would have probably dedicated most of their life to studying and understanding these and trying to practice them as best they could. And so this person would have been an expert in all of the history of the Old Testament and the stories of Israel's journey and all the things that happen. And so for them, this person to ask this question, it clearly wasn't out of wanting to gain more knowledge or more insight. And we know from the text it's saying that their motivation was to try and catch Jesus out, try and trip him up with a difficult question. But is Jesus concerned by the motives of how this person approached him? He doesn't appear fazed by that. And so is Jesus concerned or fazed when we approach him with our questions, whatever our motives is? No, he welcomes all who come to ask him. He welcomes all those who want to inquire. So if you feel wherever you are in your journey of faith that you've got questions that you're just struggling to reconcile with, Jesus welcomes those. And we'd like to say that we welcome them here at New Life Church. Any question is okay. Now, Jesus isn't fazed. And so he welcomes this question. And he says this in his response: love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence. Or you may have heard it slightly differently in other translations like this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Now, if you say that you're a follower of Jesus, this might be a good moment to have a bit of personal reflection on this challenge of what is the greatest commandment. I mean, we all love something. I think we all have been created with this desire inside to worship something, to elevate something in our lives that we look to, whatever that might be. And perhaps this is a good moment for us to reflect: is God number one in our lives? Does he determine our direction? Is he the one we come to when we have to make those big choices? Or when we feel torn between two things and we know perhaps what the right way to go should be, do we put him first? Does God get the first of our passion and our prayer and our intelligence? So he carries on, Jesus, in his answer. He doesn't just stop at saying, love God. He says this is the most important, the first on any list. But there is a second to set alongside it: love others as well as you love yourself. So he goes and leaves a slightly more awkward answer. The first one, perhaps, the Pharisee was thinking, well, I observe all these laws, I follow all these rules. That's doing my best to love God with all that I have. But then when he adds love others as yourself, it starts to become more difficult. And Jesus isn't talking about this kind of Valentine's Day love, which has its place. He's talking about something much deeper. And the problem that we have interpreting Jesus' words is that often we've lost the understanding of what biblical love is. And the love we generally think about is often only equated with some kind of intense emotions or feelings that guide us. I mean, we might say that we like chocolate or we love chocolate, and we can't help ourselves when there's some lying around, particularly when somebody else has opened the box. We might say we love a movie and we find it entertaining or moving in some way. Maybe we have a significant other that we love and we feel that they complete us in some way. But this is a kind of passive love, and biblical love's not passive in any way, and it's not strictly just emotional. To love God with all of your passion, prayer, and intelligence requires each of us to make that choice. And it's not a choice that we just make once in our lives, but I find it's a choice every day, sometimes many times a day. When I'm tempted and distracted and dragged off to go in a different way, to think thoughts or to do things or to say words that actually aren't showing that I love God and love others. God's love is an active love. So what actions can we look at in the Bible that gives us an indication of what this active love is like? Well, you may have heard these words, famous words recorded by the Apostle John. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. It was out of that active love that God chose to give. He had to make that choice. And it was out of love that Jesus chose to be obedient to that ask. You might have heard before, the night of when Jesus was arrested, he had withdrawn to a garden with his closest friends. He knew what was coming. He knew the journey of pain, of humiliation, of suffering, and ultimately the path he was going to have to tread to a cruel death on a cross. And with this weighing down on him, he uttered these words, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. I mean, these aren't the words of someone so moved by the emotional love, I don't feel, of joy and happiness to embrace what needs to be done. I mean, this sounds familiar. We know we've got to do something, but we'd rather not do it. We've got to face some sort of pain, but we'd really rather there was another way. In this case, the ultimate pain, the ultimate sacrifice. Whilst Jesus was being beaten and spat on and whipped, whilst that crown of thorns was pushed down into his head, I don't think he had these joyous emotional feelings. I think somewhere deep inside, he had made that choice that he was going to love God and to love others. It's certainly not the sort of thing that's popular on a Valentine's Day card. See, biblical love, the type of love that Jesus is talking about here, is far beyond feelings. He commands us to choose love, whether we feel like it all the time or not. And this may seem somewhat contrary to what we understand of love, whether we see it in movies or songs. But when I think about my own life, do I love my children? Yes. I mean, I don't always like what they do, but I love them very dearly. Do I love my wife? Yes, I do. But I can say we don't always feel in a state of marital bliss. It takes a choice to keep in love and to keep loving one another and loving through our actions and our words. And I can say that I've found that when I make that choice, even though I don't always feel like it, my feelings usually catch up at some point later on. I mean, when Jesus talks about love your enemies, if it was just emotions, surely that's impossible to do. But it's about a choice of love and the actions that we do from that. And the type of love that Jesus commands us to show as he's talking to these Pharisees requires us to show some action, to demonstrate it in some way. As Joel said when he kicked off the first of the messages in this series, that this is the greatest command you're ever given. It will be the greatest challenge you ever accept and the greatest cost that you'll ever pay. It's not easy to love in this way. And yet God gives us his Holy Spirit inside of us when we've chosen to follow him to help us and he's given us one another to encourage us and to support us. So what does it look like in our lives? What does it mean for us? It means making God the number one voice that has the main priority in what we do. It means we take that on board to check our motives. What are we questioning God about and why? When we're making our decisions, why are we doing that? Is it for our own selfish benefit or our preferences? Or are we choosing actively to put others first and to love others? You see, emotion is often a poor indicator of this type of love. I could share many stories about how I've experienced the type of love that Jesus talks about. I distinctly remember when each of our children was born, we had a steady stream of people arriving at the door each evening with meals for us, just to help us as we settled in. After we had our second child, my wife had a stroke and was very ill for some time. I remember being supported by those in our church family who would come round again, bringing meals, helping with the house, with practical needs that we had. I distinctly remember when we moved house, that evening we had pizza delivered to us. And the next day, a group of friends came round to help us unpack and get settled in and start making it our home. I had a period when my back was extremely bad. I couldn't walk probably more than 5 meters, couldn't drive, was in a lot of pain for a long time. But there was no shortage of people to take me to appointments and to help out with all the other jobs that I couldn't do around the home. This, I believe, is just one aspect of the sort of love that Jesus is talking about, a love that takes action, a love that decides that we're going to pay the cost of giving up our time or our money or our energy, whatever it might be. These things don't come for free, but actually they make an investment into other people's lives. And the way we treat others shows actually how our love for God is. We can't think, just like the Pharisee, that we can just love God but ignore everyone else, as easy as, perhaps convenient as that might be to do at times. But the way that we love one another reflects our love for God. At the highs and lows of my life, there have been people there from our church community who have been there to help, just as Jesus calls us to do that. I'm sorry if you've never experienced that kind of love in your life, but we mustn't be captive to our past and previous experiences. And I hope that if you join us as part of New Life Church, that you too will have times in your life when you experience that, when you're on the receiving end of that love. But in order for that to be the case, I challenge all of us, we must be ready to be the givers of that, to make those choices, to take that action to show God's love. The Apostle Paul writes this in a letter to a group of house churches that were based in Rome. He says this: Christ arrives right on time to make this happen. He didn't and doesn't wait for us to get ready. He presented himself for this sacrificial death when we were far too weak and rebellious to do anything to get ourselves ready. And even if we hadn't been so weak, we wouldn't have known what to do anyway. We can understand someone dying for a person worth dying for, and we can understand how someone good and noble could inspire us to selfless sacrifice. But God put his love on the line for us by offering his Son in sacrificial death, while we were of no use whatever to him. What Paul's saying here is that we were undeserving, that God's initial love to us, he made the first move. He took a step towards us. He took action. Just as we read earlier, God so loved the world that he gave. In his generosity of his love, he gave us an example of how to live, to extend love to those who we don't feel are worthy of it, who maybe we find difficult to get on with. We can still demonstrate and show God's love to them, because it's when we understand how much God has loved us, then we are able to share that and show that to those around us. You see, that's why Jesus puts these two things together, that we love God first and we love others as we love ourselves. If we don't know truly and deeply inside that we are known and loved, then we'll find it even more difficult to extend and to show that love to those around us. Now, if you're just exploring faith, we know Jesus will accept you at any time. He's already done the work. He's already taken that step. It's not based on performance or appearances. It's just based on making a choice to accept him and to follow him. If we call ourselves Jesus followers, then we need to take this on board. That he gives us this to, in the strongest terms, what's the greatest commandment? It's something for us to have a hallmark in our life. A hallmark of all the times when we can demonstrate God's love to those around us. And in doing so, we reflect our love for God. It should colour everything we do, and it will gradually transform our hearts each and every day that we're choosing to put God's love into action. So although Valentine's Day has come and gone, let's make every day a day when we reflect on these words that Jesus gave us. To love God with everything that we have, and to love others as ourselves. To understand that in order to do that, we need to be listening to him. As we read the Bible, as we take time in the midst of whatever's happening in our lives at the moment, to be still and to listen to his voice. To be in the company of those around us who care for us, who want the best for us, to encourage us. The more that we begin to understand just how much God loves us because he chose to love us, we'll feel empowered and enabled to choose to love those around us, even when it's difficult, even when they maybe aren't our most favourite people, or even when they may have done things that we find irritating, frustrating, annoying, or whether they have hurt us. We have the example of Jesus to look to, and he wants to strengthen us and empower us to love as he did. So let's take a moment to pray and just reflect and let this sink into our hearts. Father God, thank you that you gave us the greatest example of love. And you showed us that it was a choice you made because you loved us. And it wasn't a choice just based on emotion or fluffy feelings, but there was something deep down, deep inside, to make that choice. And then you showed your love for us by giving your Son. And we see in Jesus someone who was obedient to your call. I'm sure that he didn't want to face all of that all of that pain and suffering and the cross, to walk that path. But he chose to be obedient to your call. So God, help us today. If we find ourselves just exploring faith, to know and to experience your love, reaching out, to know that we can come to you no matter what, that you're not fazed by any question. And for those of us who say we're your followers, would we be challenged and stirred once again to know that the measure of our love for you is seen in how we love those around us. And that love is not a passive love, but it's one that takes action. Would you encourage us, strengthen us, empower us to be your hands and feet, to meet those needs that we see around us, to demonstrate an outstretching of your love. That's a reflection of our love for you. And God, for all of us, would we day by day, as we spend time in your presence, know evermore the depth of the love that you have for each of us. And out of that place of the assurance of being known and being loved, that's what enables us to love others. It's not something we can just conjure up from our own strength and will, as we know how often that fails. So would you remind us again, challenge us again, how do we show love to one another and respond to what you said was the greatest commandment? I pray you'd help us this afternoon into the rest of the week that is ahead of us, whatever challenges we're aware of that we will face. Let us go with a new perspective, thinking, how can we love in this situation? Be inspired and to be challenged by your example. Thank you, Lord. Amen. All right, well, I hope you continue to think about that in the days to come, something that will live inside and stir you and encourage you when you face that choice of challenge. We've got a few minutes now before we need to collect your children, please, at 12 o'clock. Please feel free to stick around. It is raining, so you stay around, have another drink. It's a nice chance to catch up and say hello to other people here. We'll be starting a new theme next Sunday, so we look forward to seeing you then. And have a great week, and we'll catch up soon. Thank you.